this amazing panel about such an incredibly important issue as voting rights and the Latino community, civic engagement, and what we expect to happen in the next couple of very important years for our community. I am thrilled to be joined here by so many incredible leaders that have had such a big role in making sure that this issue is front and center for our states, our nation, our political leaders, our political candidates, everyone who has a say in the decision-making process. So I would love to first, before we go into the discussion, which will be very exciting, I am so honored to be able to welcome Domingo Garcia with LULAC. Domingo, as everyone knows, he really does need no introduction, but Domingo's life is that of a self-made success and public servant, spanning decades of hard work and sacrifice. He's a son born of Mexican immigrants who earned his way from shoeshine boy to the State House of Texas as an elected lawmaker. As LULAC national president, Mr. Garcia has fought for the voting rights of Latinos in the United States. His latest efforts include LULAC's lawsuits against the state of Texas and Iowa for the restrictive laws that they have passed during the recent legislatures that are so harmful to all Americans and to specifically Latinos. He is no stranger to the national scene, and we are so excited to have him join us here today. Welcome, Domingo. Thank you so much for being here and for your leadership and for LULAC's leadership in this incredibly important issue.
Thank you. My name is Domingo Garcia. I'm the National President of LULAC. It's been an honor to serve the nation's largest and oldest Latino civil rights organization. And these are really challenging times, as we've seen across the country with the rise of the Latino numbers that we saw in the census. First, we saw efforts to undermine our census counts. We still believe that the census is inaccurate. In district after district, we've seen Latino numbers that we believe have been underreported. And we're hoping that the new director of the census at some point needs to look at modifications of the census numbers to accurately reflect Latino growth and population throughout the country. But we've also seen in states like Texas, Iowa, Florida, and Georgia are attempts primarily by Republican lawmakers to curtail voting hours, to curtail voting by mail, to curtail the time that early voting is allowed. All efforts basically engage in voter suppression. And what we've seen are politicians weaponizing the legal system to bring back sort of Jim Crow. And this time it's Jose Crow. They're also going after Latino voters and Latina voters across the country. Where I live in Texas, we've seen that Governor Abbott recently signed a bill, which LULAC has now challenged in court. We filed a lawsuit 1 hour after he signed it, challenging all the new voter suppression rules, which does not allow for drop-off mail balloting, makes it harder to vote by mail. We estimate that about 1.5 million Latinos and African Americans and Asian Americans may be disenfranchised in Texas alone because of the record number of Latinos that turned out in the presidential election, which Trump only won by 4 points, and Beto O'Rourke, when he ran for Senate, only lost by 2. And so those numbers, I think, have scared some politicians. So instead of trying to win the hearts and minds of Latino and Latino voters, they are trying to rig the system. In 2018, LULAC had to file a lawsuit when they purged 120,000 voters, almost all Latino naturalized citizens. And we were successful, and those voters were reinstalled. But again, effort after effort. In Iowa, we had to file a lawsuit also where LULAC is suing the state of Iowa regarding voter suppression laws that were passed in Iowa. And Latinos are maybe only 7% of the vote in Iowa, but that can make the difference. Let me give you an example of what we've seen. In Dodge City, Kansas, many people don't know that Dodge City, Kansas is majority Latino now. There's a meatpacking plant there. So about 68% of the population of Dodge City is Latino. Well, in 2018, they moved the only polling location in Dodge City 20 miles outside the city limits to prohibit and make it more difficult for Latinos to vote. And we had an 18-year-old high school LULAC member. We filed suit, we won, and we got the polling place reinstated. But unfortunately for that election, we had to Uber voters to the polls. We had to rent vans to get to the polls, but the difference was dynamic. They elected the first Democratic governor in the history of Kansas in like 40 years. So we've seen this over and over again. And the only thing we can do is continue to ask our allies and our friends to pass the Voting Rights Act. That is something we need. The 1964 Civil Rights Act has to be reinstated in terms of the Voting Rights Act as it applies to states in the Southwest and the South, because we've seen that when you take those protections away, these politicians will devise all kinds of tricks and rigging of the system to disenfranchise primarily Black and brown voters. So LULAC will continue to be in the fight against them. We have a great panel that will probably go into detail that have been at the forefront defending our rights to vote. And I believe every Jose and Maria should have the same right to vote as every John and Mary. And that's why we are here. And we look forward to working with this dynamic panel and with all our allies in the future to make sure everybody's right to vote is protected. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Domingo. We really appreciate those words of inspiration, and it's a call to action for all of us. And that is what this upcoming panel is all about. We are here with an amazing array of leaders. I'm going to introduce them one by one. Really, none of them really need introduction. And then I'm going to ask them to go to a couple of minutes so that they can talk about what they do, how they are involved in this issue, and what they see, what they foresee for the future. And then we'll go into a little bit of a Q&A. So joining us is Sonja Diaz. She's the founding executive director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. We have with us Arturo Vargas, Chief Executive Officer of the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. Dr. Luis Fraga, Joseph and Elizabeth Robbie Professor of Political Science and Director of the Institute for Latino Research at the University of Notre Dame. Julian Castro, former 2020 presidential candidate, former Obama Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, former Mayor of San Antonio, Texas, and an NBC, MSNBC political analyst and host of Our America podcast. I am so thrilled for all of you to be joined with us here today. Let's start with you, Julian. Give us a little bit of an overview of how you see things shaping up and what you think are the biggest things we need to be thinking about on this issue.
Yeah, first, Maria, thank you so much for moderating today and for all of the great work that you do, and to Domingo for his leadership, to Joe Henry for extending the invitation to be here, and to all of the panelists and some of the folks that I see attending today on Zoom, whom I know have been so involved over the years, for decades really, in trying to ensure that everybody in our country can exercise their right to vote. And that's never been more important than today. A few months ago, just like my friend and former thesis advisor, Professor Fraga, who I know is joining us from Notre Dame, I had the opportunity to testify to a subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee on the need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and as well as what is now the Freedom to Vote Act. As I see it, there is a full court press, a full-on attack on the ability of people of color especially to exercise their right to vote. That attack is happening in a majority of states across this country, including in my home state of Texas. It's happening in Washington, D.C., with the refusal, particularly of Republicans, to update the Voting Rights Act, to restore things like preclearance, and to address the cutting off of opportunity to vote in state after state across this country. That means that it's incumbent upon all of us to use our voice, to use our platform, and incumbent upon legislators in state capitals and in Washington, D.C., to do what they can to push back and to affirmatively try and extend the ability of people who are eligible to vote to be able to do that. And so, as I see it, our window of opportunity to do that is closing. We know that the elections of 2022 may well bring a different dynamic to Washington, D.C. That means that we only have a few months, really, to get this legislation done. And in state capitals right now, redistricting is happening. That means pushing back on gerrymandered maps, pushing back on state level attempts to foreclose on mail-in balloting, drive-through voting, any number of other ways that make it more convenient, more easy for people to vote. I speak as somebody who obviously has run for office and seen it from that angle and is trying to do what I can to use my voice and platform to push back as well. And maybe most importantly, I think it's not enough to play defense. We have to play offense. We have to be as intentional and precise in expanding opportunities to vote as others have been in trying to limit those opportunities, and to push on state legislators and federal congressional representatives to do exactly that.
Thank you so much, Julian. That was a great overview. I'm going to go to Arturo Vargas next. Arturo, as you talk to us about what NALEO has been doing, tell us also what the 2020 census has opened up in terms of, or opened the eyes of the nation about the Latino community and how it has changed from the 2010 census. And what does that mean for our community's civic engagement?
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to Domingo for convening us. It's always great to be with our friends from LULAC and to be part of this panel with such good friends and experts and colleagues and allies, and to be with you, Maria. Looking forward to when we can be in person again and enjoy each other's company.
Exactly.
I've been working on the census now since the 1990 census. It's my 4th census. And early on, I came to understand how critical and foundational the census is for Latino political empowerment. The census is the foundation of our democracy. And the fact is that throughout the history of the census and Latinos, there has always been an effort to undercount the Latino population. And 2020 was unprecedented in that regard. I have to say that for the first time, it seemed like everybody across the board had made the census a priority. And I give appreciation to that, to the philanthropic community, to the many foundations who invested in census outreach. But we were up against something that was unprecedented, both external challenges to the census, such as the pandemic, wildfires, hurricanes, all that prevented people from being fully enumerated, to internal challenges. Efforts from the Trump administration to add a citizenship question, efforts by the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, to undermine the efforts of the career staff at the Census Bureau. So it is no surprise that when we saw the numbers come out first in April, that we immediately suspected a historic undercount of the Latino population in 2020. Let me explain how we saw it in April when the apportionment numbers came out. Those were counts by state. And we expected Texas to pick up 3 or 4 congressional seats. It only got 2. We expected Florida to pick up 2. It only got 1. We expected Arizona to get a congressional seat. It got none. What do these 3 states have in common? The largest growth in their populations was from the Latino population. And all 3 states either put in absolutely nothing or just a pittance at the last minute to do their own outreach efforts to encourage their populations to be counted in the census. So we saw the consequences there. And in August, when the redistricting data came out, we really saw the impact of the undercount with losses in rural areas that we know were particularly difficult to count in the pandemic. We saw losses of population in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And an analysis of the Latino population by Dr. William O'Hare showed that the undercount of very young Latino children in 2020 is very likely double what it was in 2010. One of the narratives we heard from the 2020 census when the numbers came out was, oh my gosh, look how much the Latino population has increased. There obviously was no undercount. No, all the indications are we are experiencing a historic undercount. If we had been accurately counting, our numbers would have been even greater than what they are. But we're stuck with these numbers for apportionment and redistricting, but we're not stuck with them for the next 10 years if we have a Census Bureau that's willing to be proactive and to do a correction to the data based on its evaluations that are due to come out next year, which is why I am so thrilled that come January 1, the Census Bureau, for the first time in history, is going to be led by a person of color, by a Latino, yes, I'll say it, by a Chicano, in Robert Santos. The first time that a Senate-confirmed Latino or person of color will lead the Census Bureau. And I'm hoping that in him bringing his life experience and cultural understanding of the Latino community, we'll have some remedies and opportunities to correct these numbers so that going forth, we'll have data that are more accurate in the distribution of federal funds, and that we can finally try to get this right when we come across to the 2030 census.
Thank you so much, Arturo. Let's go to you, Sonja. Arturo talked about the importance of the census, what it means, the Latino demographics, the civic engagement over the past 10 years. Redistricting is also, which Arturo also mentioned, as well as Julian, redistricting is also happening now around the country. And as we all know, that's the process by which new boundaries get drawn and determines our representation in Congress and at all levels of our governance. Can you tell us a little bit about which states gained and lost seats, and how did the change in Latino population influence these changes?
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here with you, and that LULAC is convening such an important conversation that is the first of many, because we're under attack. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, when we look at the 2020 census, there's two things that should be clear. First, there was only one demographic group that did not experience population growth between 2010 and 2020, and that was white Americans. Second, the population growth across the country was made possible by Asian Americans and Latinos, and in some places, even like California, Black Americans. And so ultimately, when the census numbers reapportion the US House of Representatives, the default, dependent on clustering of these populations, is not to bake in white power in the face of population decline, but to create new avenues of opportunity so that Latinos, Black Americans, and Asian Americans, those very same communities that safeguarded our democracy in 2020, in 2021, in the Georgia Senate runoffs, in 2021 in the California recall election, and in New Jersey just last week, are able to elect their candidates of choice. And to that end, we're confronted with a redistricting cycle that does not have the protection of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act because of the Supreme Court's decision in 2013 in Shelby County versus Holder. And what that means is, as we see vote suppression and vote denial in 47 states across the country in the face of a historic record turnout in the 2020 presidential election, these same political actors are going to be charged with drawing our political futures. A political future where Latinos have been decimated by the COVID-19 pandemic and continue to barely survive, let alone think about thriving during relief and recovery. And so when we think about who gained seats and who lost seats, we know that California lost a congressional seat. So did Illinois, and so did New York. But they didn't lose them because of Latinos or Asian Americans. In fact, they only lost one because of Asian Americans and Latinos. But for those populations' growth, they would have lost more. And so ultimately, when we think about how do we reshape these lines with this decrease, it needs to not come at the expense of our current and future workforces of color. On the other side of things, there are some states that, because of the growth of Latinos, states increase their representation in the House. This includes Colorado, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, and Oregon. Now, there's also a state that many of us forecasted would have increased their representation and did not, and that's the state of Arizona. And that's going to require some additional foresight about the census undercount. But ultimately, what I want to clearly articulate is that the states that gained and the states that lost did so because of Latinos. And what that means is that the states that gained representation, their Latino population increase. The states like California, Illinois, and New York that lost representation, they only lost one seat. They would have lost more had there not been diverse and prolific Latino communities.
That is amazing, Sonja. Thank you for that overview. I want to ask you one more question before I go to Dr. Fraga, and that is, what do LULAC members, since we're here with an amazing group of activists and other activists, need to be doing about redistricting? What is within their power? What should they be thinking is the most important thing in terms of engaging in this process?
Well, one of the things that's really clear is that the assault on voting rights is a Latino issue. And so in the way that we've seen vote dilution and gerrymandering occur over history, it continues to persist and target the nation's growing Latino communities. And the role of LULAC members is to issue spot, to support litigation, be plaintiffs, cooperate with civil society, and with government to the extent that your government is actually looking at progressive reform instead of regressive silencing. I'll speak from my experience as the head of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. I know that LULAC has been a partner to us in our litigation in the state of Washington and the state of Texas. LULAC is important for identifying exactly what Domingo mentioned when they close down a polling location. But it's also important in places where we're doing litigation, like in Franklin County, Washington, where redistricting seeks to dilute the power and the voting strength of Latinos. And so the role here is to actively engage in the map drawing, also recognizing fully that it is not a fair process. It is a political process, and the political power lays with the people who are passing nefarious pathways towards voter suppression because they do not want the historic turnout that we saw, or if I'm being generous, they see it as a ceiling and not a floor. And so, stand up, be plaintiffs, issue spot litigation problems, and know that the country and our democracy is on fire. The federal government does not have enough resources to deal with all of these vote denial, vote suppression, voter ID, signature matching cases. But in that way, LULAC plays an important role.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sonja. I'm going to go to you, Dr. Fraga. So states across the country passed restrictive voting laws. We have been mentioning those in the legislative sessions in this past year. And we've seen so many that are getting ready or wanting to do even worse. So could you give us an overview of the state of voting rights across the country, the laws, the restrictive proposals that are being put in place, and how that is going to essentially affect our ability to vote in the country?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Maria. And thank you, Domingo. Thank you to my dear friends, Dan Estrada and Julian Castro, Secretary Castro, for the opportunity to be here. The specific laws that have been passed in states as of this time are substantial. Between January 1st and May 14th, 2021, at least 14 states enacted 22 new laws that restrict access to the vote. 61 bills with restrictive provisions are moving through 18 state legislatures. Overall, 389 bills, as was said before, in 48 states were proposed in the 2021 legislative session. All of this is possible because of a decision by the Supreme Court in Shelby v. Holder and the more recent decision of the Supreme Court in Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee. What is the nature of those restrictive laws? Shortening the window to apply for a mail ballot. Some of these have already been mentioned. Shortening the deadline to deliver a mail ballot, making it harder to submit and remain on an absentee ballot voting list, eliminating or limiting spending mail ballot allocations to voters who do not specifically request them, eliminating or limiting sending mail ballots to voters who do not specifically request them, eliminating day registration, reducing polling place availability, limiting early voting days and hours, and others. What is significant here is that states are simply responding to the forced withdrawal by the federal government of voting rights enforcement through Supreme Court decisions. And what's important to remember about these two Supreme Court decisions and the withdrawal of the federal government from enforcing our voting laws because the court doesn't allow them is that this is part of American history. Not to justify it, but this is the reemergence, or perhaps better stated, the continuing practice in the United States of limiting voting, especially to communities of color, when their numbers rise. This is what happened in the post-Reconstruction or Jim Crow era, when over 1,000 African Americans registered to vote. And at one time, there were over 1,000 African American elected officials right after the Civil War. This happened, of course, over a period of about 20 years, but after 1900, then Southern state legislatures in particular drafted new state constitutions that led to the total exclusion of African American voters. Latinos, similarly, in states like Texas, were affected by these types of laws. As is often said in political science, politics and elections are about margins. All of these state efforts to limit the effectiveness, however small or however large those limits are, all of them are designed to give a marginal advantage to those who are perceived to not have the interests of Latinos in mind, or who do in fact have the interest of limiting Latino voters, or who don't want Latinos voters to vote at all. And in that circumstance, what becomes overwhelmingly clear when you take the view of history, what becomes overwhelmingly clear is that protection and expansion of voting rights is only possible with active, full, and forceful federal government action. That's the case throughout our history. And when the federal government withdraws, either through judicial decisions or politics or other reasons, those laws come back and are reimposed to limit the extent to which communities of color are able to access and exercise the franchise. One last point, given the way in which Latinos are growing as a percent of the population, but especially given the way in which Latinos are growing as a percent of the qualified or otherwise qualified electorate, we know we will remain for a long time a major target of efforts to limit voting to communities of color, with a specific emphasis on limiting the capacity of Latinos to register and to vote.
Dr. Fraga, before I go to Julian, let me ask you one other question. And that is, as we know, the Voting Rights Act has been gutted in recent years. And that's why you've seen these, I think, this whole group of voting new laws in these states. They feel like they can do anything. So what needs to happen in Congress in order to shore up the voting rights here in the United States in lieu of everything that we're seeing at the state level? And would that then keep these extreme laws in the states from being passed, or from having the effect that we know some people want them to have?
What we know is required more than anything is the removal of the filibuster, particularly with regards to voting rights, because there has already been majority Democratic support for both the John Lewis Voting Advancement Act and the For the People Act by Democrats in the House. It has not passed the Senate because of the nature of the filibuster. It is not possible to get any support from Republicans for this legislation. Those who are familiar with the specific strategies of parliamentary maneuvering in the Senate, the master parliamentarians, not the parliamentarian, the master parliamentarians need to put together a strategy, perhaps restricted to not allowing the filibuster on voting rights issues, because of the way in which the filibuster historically has been used to prevent racial inclusion and racial equity, because of that history, which is well documented, agreed to, no one can question its purpose, that is needed in order to allow for progress to be made and to inhibit states from passing these laws. But even if that happens, we have to recognize the challenge of the 6 conservative majority on the Supreme Court. They are the ones who decided the Brnovich versus Democratic National Committee decision in 2021, that 6-person Republican majority is going to be another major barrier, even if Congress were to take action. And we know this because of past decisions. We know this because among the major leaders, and it pains me to say this, of efforts to try to deny access to the ballot as a result of the strong enforcement of the Voting Rights Act is our Chief Justice, John Roberts. In fact, a classmate of mine from undergraduate days. And Justice Roberts, from the time that he was a young assistant attorney general as a member of the White House counsel staff and the attorney general staff, wrote memos talking about the unconstitutionality of Section 5. So now we have in the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, someone who has an let me see if I get my math right, 30-year history of being very suspicious, if not openly antagonistic, of something like Section 5 and of efforts by the federal government to try to ensure voting rights.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraga. I want to go back to Julian. Julian, you were a candidate in 2020. You, better than all of us here, know what's at stake for the country and for our community in the upcoming midterm elections, but also for the upcoming 2024 elections. Give us a little side-by-side commentary on what you think is going to happen next year, and then what you think is going to happen in 2024, and how can the Latino community become the architects of our own future vis-a-vis politics and our political involvement?
That's a great question, Maria. And let me start off by just piggybacking on something that Luis said, which is that I agree that Latinos are going to have a target on their back for a long time, as are other communities of color that are growing and having a bigger and bigger impact, especially in these states that are flipping over and adding electoral votes to the Democratic column, places like Arizona, Georgia, soon the state of Texas. What's at stake really is our progress as a country toward a place where everybody can live with dignity and be treated with respect. It's the difference between state legislatures and governors that are willing to fund public education well and make sure that, you know, our young people, remember ours, Latinos, Latinas, a young community, a striving community, oftentimes a community that has been undereducated in many places. So it matters whether public education is funded. It matters whether housing opportunity is adequately funded. It matters whether infrastructure and public transit opportunity is funded, and economic opportunity is well invested in. There's a positive agenda which we can reach for, or what we saw over the last 4 years, a negative agenda of scapegoating, of anti-immigrant rhetoric and actions and legislation, and a country where we're seen more and more as the other, as alien, as foreigners, as not part of the story of progress and development in the United States, which we certainly have contributed to. And so I think that's what's at stake. It's the issues in 2022 and in 2024, whether the investments are made that are going to allow communities of color, including the Latino community, to reach its full potential or not. And of course, we had results the other day in Virginia and New Jersey. And so far, the results look like midterm years or off years for the party out of power of the White House. We know that, or we think that for Democrats, it's going to be a very challenging year. But part of the story of Virginia, at least, was that while white turnout shot up, communities of color, their turnout did not shoot up in the same way. That means that you need to figure out ways to get people motivated, get them enthusiastic to vote, and need to protect the ability and the ease with which people can vote in the first place. So this conversation that we're having today couldn't be more timely and more urgent.
Thank you so much, Julian. Arturo, I want to come back to you. After having heard all of our great panelists, Julian, Dr. Fraga, Sonja, in terms of what's at stake, how can our elected leaders adjust better, both to the challenges that we know we've already had as a community, but also now married with the census numbers that I think pretty much surprised everyone when they came out last year. And so what should our nation's lawmakers and candidates for office, right, if they want to be elected, what do they need to be doing more to meet our nation's and our community's changing demographics?
Well, first I'd like to react to Dr. Braga's wonderful summary of the challenges we have given the new restrictive voting rights laws that have been put in place, or voter suppression laws, and some of the issues that Secretary Castro articulated. And like just to remind everyone that if the Latino vote were inconsequential, if we were not having an impact at the local, state, and federal level in the way that Latinos are voting, we wouldn't see these kinds of efforts to turn back the clock on Latino voting power and participation. It is because we're having an impact. It is because we're a threat to the status quo that we are seeing these efforts. So one of the things I call upon LULAC and all of our sister organizations and NALEO members who are elected officials is we need to double down on everything we've been doing. We need to increase our efforts to ensure that Latinos register to vote, that those who are lawful permanent residents and are eligible to become citizens go through the naturalization process, and all eligible Latinos who are citizens 18 years of age and over vote. The fact is that if a Latino is registered to vote, they are very, very likely to be a voter. We made a big deal of the fact that in 2020, about 54% of all Latino eligible voters voted, and we broke that 50% ceiling for the first time. But what we didn't say enough is that it also represented 88% of all Latinos registered to vote. If we can get Latinos registered to vote, they're going to vote. So what I think policymakers need to do is we need to figure out how do we make voter registration and voting more accessible. We need to look at the best practices out of California, out of Colorado, and other states that are putting a ballot in every voter's hand. If you're registered to vote, you get a ballot delivered to you in the mail, so you can decide to vote from home, take it with you to a polling location, to empower voters to participate. We need to take these actions, and policymakers overall, what they need to be doing, elected officials, is two things I would say. One is listen to the constituents, listen to the priorities that are of your constituents and particularly of your voters. Don't assume the issues for them. One of the things we saw in the Latino tracking poll leading up to the 2020 election is that consistently the top three issues on the mind of Latino voters was the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, access to healthcare, and the economy. These are the issues that Latino voters want to hear from our policymakers. And the second thing is, don't take them for granted. Get out there and hustle for their votes. Don't assume that because you're in a safe district, you can cruise to re-election. You need to go out and engage voters. That's what voters want, because when we ignore them, then we have even lower voter turnouts, because Latino voters feel they're being taken for granted and they only matter when it's a close election and tons of money is thrown at the last minute to Latino voter outreach. We need sustained, engaged Latino voter civic participation and engagement consistently.
Amen, Arturo. I have a column out today in the Hill that I will send around to everyone that essentially says that Latinos have now become the nation's one of the most important swing voters. And that's how the party needs to treat them, because if they treat them as the base, they're not really going to try to persuade them. And I believe from everything that I've heard today, Latinos need to be persuaded by the policies that whatever party or whatever candidate is wanting to pass, that those are the best policies for our community. So everyone needs to come and woo us, I think is the lesson. I'm gonna give a series of questions that I would like everyone to take a turn in answering. And they essentially will wrap up the discussion. The first one is, what is the call to action to LULAC? I know that I gave this question to Sonja, but now that we've heard sort of in its entirety, the challenges that are ahead and the kind of power that Latinos have that they can use, what can LULAC members do? And what can everyone who is joining us today here as well do? How can they use their powerful voice? And so the first one is, how can they do that in the next year? And then how can they do that in the next 3 to 4 years? We know that one of our biggest challenges is just exhaustion, right? It is hard to stay motivated and to stay mad and to stay outraged at everything that has happened. But that is one of the things that we have to urge our community to do. So let me start with Dr. Fraga.
Well, I agree with Arturo and Joaquin and Sonja about the importance of having sustained, I want to say, motivation provided for Latino voters and all voters. And it is the maintenance of that sustained view, sustained interest, sustained engagement that is the key for our being able to move forward. No one has a magic bullet as to how to do that, although there are some examples. One of the examples taken from Nevada is that you don't just do it by registering voters, you do it by strategically registering voters and engaging with, in the case of Nevada, unions, and being able to rely upon union membership. A strategy that is not often used and isn't easy to do necessarily, but absolutely necessary, is to think of the possibility of churches, whether Protestant or Catholic. Of course, I have a preference for Catholic churches, but Catholic because I'm in Notre Dame. But Catholic churches remain among the most resistant. I'm not talking about, endorsing candidates. I would want them to threaten their 501c3 status, but talking about the importance of participation and the way in which that is fully consistent with their religious values, and I would argue fully consistent with Scripture. You cannot be a good, whatever your religion is, unless you try to use your values to influence the political process as a way to help everyone in similar situations. And I think we need, and I know these happen in DC and other places, but I think we need a type of summit and maybe a sustained commitment to summits where we try to work through these issues, learn from each other, bring the experience and perspectives that we have from each other to be able to see whether that as a relatively distinct strategy is a way from which everyone can possibly learn and be even better than the excellent work that's done. What an organization like LULAC can do is, because of the number of councils that it has across the country, it provides a community basis for keeping attorneys informed, for providing evidence to those who are filing lawsuits, and writing to state legislators, to members of the House and members of the Senate. I can't tell you how influential that can be, and I think that's one place where Latinos have fallen short and where we can relatively easily increase our presence in the minds and thinking of legislators once we get rid of the filibuster. I just wanted to throw that in again.
I want to piggyback on that because I think what Dr. Fraga was talking about, and he didn't mention it explicitly, is trusted messengers. And so there's one thing about the message not even being targeted to non-white voters, including low propensity voters or newly eligible voters. It's another thing about who is carrying that message. And so at a place where we have massive misinformation and disinformation, and then we have the willful neglect of non-white voters, places like LULAC, including other trusted messengers, whether they are teachers, doctors, healthcare workers, those are places where you can get verifiable information that has policy consequence. Some of the research that we did in California in the 18 midterms, and then we re-upped in 2020, was the role of community clinics in ensuring that low propensity voters actually get a door knock, that they're getting mobilized when they come and see their doctor. In addition to like, what is your weight? Are you having health problems? Are you registered to vote? Do you know that there's an election? And guess what? Healthcare is on the ballot every single time we cast a ballot. And so what we found is that the number of ballots increased with that target. And what we also understood in California during the 2021 gubernatorial recall, there was no investment in Latino voters, but there was a Latino boogeyman. And the Latino boogeyman was that even in COVID-19, when California was the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic in North America, Latinos were being blamed. We're on the front lines, we're in the fields, we're in the doctor's offices, you name it. And there's erroneous polling saying that we support a white-led effort to recall that was based on xenophobia, based on anti-immigrant policy, based on criminalization, based on housing scarcity, that it was us. It was not us. And research out of UCLA verified 3-1 Latinos voted against the recall. My real question is, when are either party or candidates or campaigns going to invest in these voters? And until they do, the LULACs of the world, the community clinics, the schools, your families, we're the trusted messengers. We're the ones who mobilize, and then that can swing elections.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraga. Arturo, let me go to you.
Let me react to a comment in the chat. Someone said that being that Latinos vote Democratic, what is being done to engage the Democratic Party? Latinos, as you know, Maria, from your column, being a swing electorate, Latinos are not just Democratic voters.
That's right.
And we will make a mistake if we think that all Latinos will vote Democrats, and that there is not, in fact, a strong presence of republicanism in the Latino electorate. But not every Latino Republican will always vote Republican. Not every Latino Democrat will always vote Democrat. We've seen that in elections. This is why engaging voters directly is so important. Do not assume what the issues are that are important to Latino voters. You got to get out there and talk to Latino voters, listen to them, understand their priorities, and then speak to them from where they are. And we don't have campaigns at the presidential level often enough that do that. In fact, I attribute that to laziness, that people think that they can just put up, ads that have been translated from English to Spanish, and maybe they've been, put out together by a PR firm that understands Latino culture, and they're, a little bit more snazzy, and then you're done. No. It's retail politics. You got to get out and engage people. You have to hustle for the vote. And if you don't do that, we're going to miss out. And what can LULAC do? What can organizations do? We need to be part of that movement of bringing all of our community into the conversation of what it means to participate in American democracy. And it doesn't mean just voting. It's writing to our elected officials, as Professor Fraga pointed out, holding elected officials accountable from both political parties, whether you voted for them or not. We need to be stakeholders in our democracy and act like it.
Thank you so much, Arturo. Julian, bring us home. What can we do? What is in our hands to make possible?
Well, there's a lot of power in our hands and a lot of power in LULAC's hands. LULAC, as everybody on the Zoom, I'm sure, understands, was founded in 1929 here in Texas at a time when Latinos were under attack, but also knew very much in their hearts and minds that they had something that they were already contributing to America, and much more that they could contribute. And it was about helping each other. And so I think that as we go forward, LULAC has a role to play that it's always played in pushing in state legislatures and in DC, because the fact is that it's one of the very small few organizations that is recognized as a national Latino organization that is seen as sort of speaking for the broader Latino community. Secondly, activate your networks. It's still about those mutualistas, that mutual aid society and the networks, that Luis was talking about as well, that are active out there in chapters across the United States. I think about LULAC Council number 2, one of the largest councils here in San Antonio, and the difference that it's made through its activities and through the word of mouth and getting the vote out and ensuring that candidates are held accountable. And then also there's an auxiliary but important role to play in supporting efforts of MALDEF and other organizations as they push back in the courts. For the time being, even though we don't have a Supreme Court that we can count on immediately, because we're limited in Washington and limited in a lot of these state legislatures, the best hope may be in some of these state courts and federal courts right now to at least stave things off. And then maybe most importantly, each and every one of us is empowered in our daily lives to make sure that our friends and our family, our coworkers are registered to vote, and that we help get them out to vote when that time comes. We can do that no matter where we're at or who's on the ballot.
Thank you so much, Julian. I want to thank this amazing panel, Arturo, Dr. Fraga, Sonja, Julian. You all are the voices that we need to listen to if we want to make sure that not just our community shows up for our community, but that our community shows up for our country, and that the candidates and our leaders are doing what they need to do to ensure that our voices are included, not just in the national discussion, but in the solutions that we know our communities have so much of a vested interest. As our Latino community goes, so goes the country. I want to turn it over now to Joe Henry for closing remarks. Joe Henry is the president of LULAC Council 307 in Iowa. Joe is a graduate of the Iowa State University and has worked in various capacities, from elected and appointed positions in the International Brotherhood of Teamsters to the League of United Latin American Citizens and Forward Latino. Mr. Henry was awarded the Louise Noun Award by the American Civil Liberties Union of Iowa. Joe, thank you so much for being here. Welcome. And we are excited to hear what you have to say.
Maria, thank you so much. And thank you, panelists. Thank you all. I mean, so much important information has come out in this panel discussion. And just to kind of recap where we are looking at things in LULAC is that we are working to promote aggressive and ongoing field operations on the ground, knocking on doors, face-to-face contact. That's how we do things. Latino organizations must work together to register to vote, to identify and organize in each and every community. We can do that in LULAC, and we can do that with other groups too. We have a great history of working on the ground with many of our councils. We need to utilize voter files for outreach, getting into the neighborhoods, identifying existing voters, and then also mobilizing registered new voters. We need to work with unions, religious groups, other nonprofit groups to build those coalitions. I see Paula Martinez is on this call right now. Thank you, Paula, from the Iowa South Central Federation of Labor. But we need to work with all these groups. We had 32 million eligible Latino voters in 2020. Over half of those did vote, but we need to do more, and we need this long-term field operation. So with the work of all the people that are part of this town hall right now, working in coalition with other Latino groups and other fellow travelers, we can make this happen. So thank you all for being here and participating. We look forward to working with each and every one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thank you so much to all of the panelists. Again, This was an incredible discussion, and I hope that all of the great ideas and proposals and reasons why our community needs to be present are things that we all listen to and take to heart. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm having an issue with my computer here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Here we go. Thank you so much. Again, I'm going to repeat what I had to say because I think it's important. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, LULAC, for really making sure that this conversation is had and making sure that it is not the last time that we have this conversation. From Julian to Arturo to Sonja to Dr. Fraga to Domingo Garcia, our fearless leader at LULAC, we heard as to why it is so important for all of us to maintain all of these issues front and center and to make sure that we use our voices for the betterment of our community, for the betterment of our country. It is up to us, amigos. We can be the architects of our own future if we understand the power that is in our hands and the power that is in our voices. We have to use that power. And LULAC, thank you so much. You all are always there at the front lines, showing us how to use that power, and then holding our elected leaders accountable whenever they don't see the Latino community for the incredibly important contributions that it makes to this country and the incredibly important part of this country that it is. So thank you everyone for being here today. I can't wait until the next conversation, and I hope it'll be very soon. Muchas gracias.